Hello, this is Bevin with Perceptive Souls. And one of the questions I'm asked is, what exactly is a perceptive soul? So I wanted to take a few moments to make this short video to introduce you to this concept and to give you some standard baseline information about highly sensitive people, about empaths and intuitives. So I created this term, perceptive souls, as an overarching umbrella that is really inclusive of all kinds of people who are really tuned in, whose brain and central nervous system is more open to stimulus in our environment, and who not only sense that which is on the surface, but everything that's underneath, that's not said, that's not brought up to the surface level, and things that are even beyond that, even other dimensions. So that kind of encapsulates the word perceptive, right? And then there's this word souls. Souls denotes this deeper connection to the oneness, to source energy, to the divine, our unique spiritual personal growth journey that we go on. So this beautiful umbrella term is what I created to be really inclusive of all of you out there who have these various traits. And let's get started. Let's talk a little bit about highly sensitive people. Let's talk about empaths. And let's talk about being intuitive. So here we see a graph, a chart that I created that's based not only upon scientific research, but some of my own experiences, my own life experiences, as well as observing after working with hundreds and hundreds of clients in this space. And you see over here on the left, there are a group of people in the human population who have a low sensitivity to stimuli or what I call energy. Everything is just vibrating at a specific frequency. And so some people have a low sensitivity to those vibrations. They really don't pick up and sense a lot of other things other than what they can just see with and experience with their five senses. And then we have the majority of human beings, which are moderately sensitive to stimulus and to energy. And this is probably why our world, sometimes for those of us on this other end of the scale, why our world feels so fast-paced and chaotic and maybe too loud and too bright, because, majority of humans only have a moderate sensitivity to stimuli. And so they're kind of setting the tone for broader culture. And then we get into this kind of tan-colored slice, and this is where there's been a great deal of scientific research that I'm going to speak about on highly sensitive people, those that are highly sensitive, biologically speaking, to stimulus and to energy. And on this far end, and this far right side, are people who are extremely sensitive to stimulus and energy. And these would be people I would call empaths, mediums, the people who have clairvoyance, clairsentience, clairaudience, claircognizance. So this gives you kind of this spectrum, and just like any other scientific principle, it's usually on a bell curve. And so depending on where you feel like you fit in, you'll see yourself somewhere on this human spectrum. So first, let's talk about highly sensitive people. Research has been conducted for the past 25 years, starting with Dr. Elaine Aron, who coined the term highly sensitive and wrote the book, The Highly Sensitive Person. And in her research and the research of other scientists and psychologists, they have discovered that around 25% of the human population were born as a highly sensitive person. And that sensitive is this like a really interesting word because we have a lot of connotations about it. We think, oh, that person's too sensitive, they can't take any criticism, and it's really not about that. What it is about is how your brain, your central nervous system, and to some extent your body is reactive to stimuli in the environment. And they believe this may be a genetic trait that's passed down through families. So as I talk about this, if you really start to resonate with this, if you see yourself as a highly sensitive person, you might think back and go, well, who else in my family also expresses these traits? So it's a really interesting piece to discover. And the studies show that 50% of HSPs, highly sensitive person, are men and 50% are women. So we would mostly say that sensitivity is a feminine trait, although, really highly sensitive men can express all of these things just as much as women do. But our society tends to really discourage men from having some of these traits, from showing their deeper emotions, from being more sensitive and more tuned in. And so this is a work in progress for us. And many highly sensitive men really struggle with this, particularly in childhood and being a sensitive boy. But I think it's getting better, and we're getting more conscious, and we're becoming more aware and allowing a wider variety of ways of being for the genders. And most importantly, being highly sensitive is not a problem or a diagnosis. You know, it's not something that's included in the diagnostic statistical manual. It's not a psychological problem. It's actually a temperament trait. It's similar to the way that some people are certain temperaments for Myers-Briggs, and we'll talk a little bit about Myers-Briggs in a few slides, and then how some people have certain communication styles. HSP is just something that we're born with, and this is how we are. And there are 4 characteristics that science has discovered about highly sensitive people. So you may, as I talk through this, start to resonate with this and say, oh yeah, that really describes me. And the first of those is our depth of processing, or how deeply we think and we process information from the world around us. So what I like to say is that a lot of people might process things 2 or 3 different ways. They look at this angle and that angle, and maybe it's either or. Highly sensitive people tend to look at a situation or a challenge, something they're trying to find a solution for, and they'll look at it from 17 different angles. And they'll not only contemplate it today, but they'll think about it overnight. They'll think about it a week from now and maybe 2 months from now, and they'll come back and they'll say, you remember when we had that conversation 4 months ago? I have this really interesting idea about that. And so this is how our brain processes. And sometimes in our very fast-paced society, that can feel like a lot of pressure. To come up with an answer really quickly, to define something. And it's like, wait, I just need some time to process that. But there's nothing wrong with that. It's exactly who you're meant to be. And they've actually done brain scans to show there are different aspects of an HSP's brain that light up with certain scenarios than someone who does not identify as highly sensitive. So it's actually some kind of brain function. Now, the second one is overstimulation. And this is a propensity for us when we get into an environment which is highly chaotic or very loud, or there's a lot of traffic, or there's a huge number of people. Crowds seem to be a big one for overstimulation. Things that are really noisy, really affect some highly sensitive people. We can get overstimulated by the texture of our clothing, like if there's a scratchy tag in the back of your shirt or a little pebble in your shoe and you just can't take that. You have to stop and fix it. And so what is overstimulation for one sensitive person will be different than for another. But one of the things that's super important for HSPs to remember is that we can manage this overstimulation. It's not like we can be in stimulating environments and not get overstimulated, because our brain and central nervous system is literally more wide open. It's more receptive to all of these messages and all of this energy coming in. And so basically, what we need to do is really manage how long we stay in a chaotic environment, and what kind of environments and people and activities really support us and nurture us, as opposed to drain us. And so highly sensitive people tend to need more downtime and more alone time than others, even if a sensitive person is an extrovert. And highly sensitive people can be introverts or they can be extroverts. Even an HSP extrovert is going to need more downtime than the average person in order to kind of refill, to be in your own space and your own energy, and to relax and let the nervous system just relax down. The third characteristic that science has discovered is emotional responsiveness. So obviously every human being has emotional responsiveness to an extent, but highly sensitive people respond more strongly to both negative stimuli and positive stimuli. So if we see something that's extremely upsetting, say you watch a movie with a lot of violence, or you're seeing things on TV, it's very fear-based, an HSP will respond to a much greater degree and feel a deeper sense of emotions, very strong, intense emotions about that. On the other side, if you find that something's really joyous, or you're awestruck by this beautiful sunset, or you're having this beautiful moment with another person, there's a deeper sense and a more emotional intensity on the positive side. So this emotional responsiveness goes both directions. And, one of the things that some HSPs say that they really struggle with is like, wow, the tears like come up to the surface very easily. Even for men, this happens. And so it can be very uncomfortable in public when you watch, say, a commercial on TV that's really touching, and all of a sudden you just feel yourself like tearing up, and people are like, but one of the opportunities that we have is to be emotional leaders, because we are tuned in more to this emotional intelligence. And we tend to have more empathy towards others, more compassion. We're very heart connected. We care a lot about other people, about animals, about our planet, about what happens to humanity. So this is really a strength for us, but it's also something that we can manage. And the fourth aspect that science has discovered about highly sensitive people is our sensitivity to subtleties. So we notice the smallest details, whether that is the nuances of the colors that are in a flower, some different kinds of smells. We can sense subtleties and patterns, or we see, wow, I saw that pattern over here and I see it over here. Or we notice when we walk into a room that something has changed in our environment, because what we're doing when we're coming in is we're doing this depth of processing, and we're looking and taking in everything and kind of recording that, if you will. And so when things change, when we see that our coworker comes in and their body language is a little different today, we think, I wonder what's going on with them. So we're kind of reading all of these things and noticing all of these subtleties. And as you can see, these four characteristics actually create an acronym, DOES, D-O-E-S. So it's a good way for you to remember that. So let's talk about, obviously, with any temperament trait, there are challenges and there are strengths. And challenges for HSPs, one of the things that we have a tendency to do is to be a perfectionist. I mean, when you notice all the subtleties of life, you notice when things are spot on, and you notice when things aren't quite right. And so sometimes we can take that to the nth degree, where we're always trying to make something perfect. And so this is something to work on. How do we just let go or let something be good enough without needing to have it absolutely perfect? And then that criticism sometimes gets directed within into negative self-talk, like, oh, I can't believe I said something that way. When you're more tuned in and you're more aware of everything, you're more aware of other people, you're more aware of yourself, you're going to tend to potentially be more critical of yourself and others. And so, just being aware of that is really important. And one of the biggest things that HSPs deal with is feeling misunderstood, because if you are only 25% of a larger culture, you are in essence going to be a cultural minority. And the way you experience the world, as we saw by that bell curve and that scale at the beginning, is different than the majority of other people. So you may notice, wow, the lights are really bright in this room, but someone else is like, I don't understand what you're talking about. And it's not that we're misunderstood, it's that they literally don't have the same experience as we do, because they're not wired the same way. So there can be a lot of healing in understanding that and really embracing that. And then obviously, because we have this tendency to be more emotionally responsive and to be overstimulated, we can struggle more when there are negative or unsupportive environments. And that can happen in our family systems, that can happen out in the workplace, it can happen in relationships. And relationships are particularly can be a challenge at some points for HSPs, but doesn't have to stay that way. But many HSPs grew up in a family system where there were toxic or codependent patterns that were being played out. And so we go out into adulthood and we play those things out again until we learn how to value ourselves, until we learn positive communication, how to set boundaries, and so forth. And so this is something that, it doesn't have to be that way, and not every HSP has toxic or codependent relationships, but it can be something to watch out for, because HSPs are givers. Sometimes we attract people who want to take, and so it's really important to just be aware of those things. However, highly sensitive people have a lot of strengths. You know, we are very conscientious. We're always looking to do the right thing. We feel really deeply for other people. We want to understand how is this going to affect everyone who's involved and what's the long-term impact of that. HSPs tend to be very creative. They're very creative thinkers, and then they can be artistically creative. Many HSPs are really drawn to art and music and theater and writing and those kinds of things, just as part of the nature. We have the ability to see things from a lot of different perspectives. So even if a person doesn't agree with us or we don't agree with them, many times an HSP can actually understand where they're coming from and be able to put themselves in that place. We are very self-reflective. Maybe over 50% of the people who are in therapy or doing personal growth work are HSPs, because we tend to really want to do that improvement. We want to be the best person that we can. And so I think that's a positive thing. It can also be a thing where we push ourselves too much. But, you know, being self-reflective is obviously really important. And then, of course, we thrive in positive and supportive environments. So when we move ourselves into those places where we seek out people who are like-minded, when we find those places that don't really overstimulate us, but actually energize us, then we can really thrive at a greater extent. And mostly we like to seek out communities of like-minded people. So that's why you're here. That's why you're coming together with others who really understand you, who get you. I call it finding your tribe. So these are some of the strengths. Now let's move and shift to talking about what does it mean to be an empath. Now we talked about being a highly sensitive person and that there were, you know, decades of scientific research. What I'll say about being an empath is there's very little research about what it means to be an empath. So most of what you're going to read online, see on YouTube videos, or hear is people's personal experiences. And the reason that hasn't really happened yet is that a lot of scientists are really hesitant to kind of put their reputation on the line to study something which for a very long time had been considered paranormal or psychic, and that had a negative connotation in some ways. Empaths and the definition of empath, you know, kind of varies depending on what you look at. So over here on the left, it could be the ability to feel other people's emotions as if it's your own. And that means that, like, literally if someone in the room is feeling grief, you feel that grief inside your body as if you're experiencing what they're experiencing. It can be having a direct experience of another person's way of being. So we'll talk a little bit about how some empaths can have a direct experience of another person's physical sensations, pain or tension in their body. And a lot of people go into healing work because they're able to do that. The person with paranormal abilities, you know, I'm not as big of a fan of this kind of definition, only because for empaths, doing what we do and feeling what we feel and knowing what we know is normal for us. So it may not be normal for the majority of human beings, but it is actually normal for an empath. So the definition to the right is the one that I created, which is the ability to sense shifts in energy fields around you. So earlier we talked about, you know, where science and physics has defined that everything is energy in motion. Well, we can sense all of these different energy fields and what's shifting and changing. And we'll talk a little bit about what that looks like. You know, as I said, we don't really know what percentage of humans are more empathic, as mainstream scientific research has been pretty limited. But, you know, estimates put it between 3 to 5%. And so that would still be approximately 400 million people on Earth, which is a pretty high, you know, pretty high number. And I've observed that empaths are a subset of highly sensitive people. So I believe, and not everyone agrees with me, that you must be a highly sensitive person. You must have a brain and central nervous system that's more tuned in order to then be an empath. But an empath is sort of like HSP 2.0. You know, let's call them extremely sensitive people. They're way over on that right-hand side of the graph. And being an empath is not a problem or a diagnosis. It's simply a way that you perceive the world. And we have the ability to sense the language of energy. So we have some challenges as well and some strengths. The biggest challenge for empaths is becoming drained by other people's energy. So we go out into public and we pick up all of these shifts in other people's energy fields. You know, each person has their own personal energy field surrounding them. Science has even described this. You know, the heart math program has described this. They've measured these scientifically. So when we're interacting with all these different energies, and people can be very mixed, and there are a lot of emotions that go on, and we can pick this up and sense it, you know, it can easily become draining. We have a tendency to give too much. You know, we want to be in service. We see that there's a need. We want to help. We want to give and serve. But sometimes we do that to the point where we don't take care of ourselves and we can't set healthy boundaries, where we're hesitant to say no. You know, we have a tendency to try to rescue or fix others. We see people and we're like, wow, they have a lot of potential. You know, maybe I could help them. Maybe I could help heal them. You know, I think empaths are natural healers. But what we forget is that every person needs their challenges in order to grow. And when we steal that opportunity, we try to help them and rescue them, then we're actually stealing their opportunity to learn and grow. Many empaths feel like they have to hide their gifts because others do not understand them or are afraid of what you know or can do. And a lot of times it's happened in childhood. You know, maybe you had prophetic dreams, or you could sense things about people and you would say that outright because as a child you don't have much of a filter. And many of my clients say, you know, when I was a child, that kind of got shut down for me. It wasn't safe to be that. It wasn't safe to express this. And so many empaths feel, you know, that kind of fear of being ostracized or being ridiculed. Or, you know, on one hand, many times, if there are very, very sort of fundamentalist religious people, and that religion can be any type of religion, they might think that some of these things are evil or wrong to be expressing. And on the other hand, we have science which says, well, I can't really replicate this in the laboratory, so perhaps being an empath isn't real. And so empaths are kind of in this liminal space between those two things, and it's really about being really comfortable with who you are and really honoring your own gifts, regardless of what other people think. And that just takes some time and some practice. So taking on what's not yours, that's something we talked about, and having a lack of boundaries. So empaths can really easily merge into the oneness, and we're not really sure, like, where does my energy field end and where do you begin, and where does a tree end and where do I begin? And, you know, so this can be something that we struggle with. However, we have these beautiful strengths. You know, we're able to connect with that divine spark in all beings. We understand the larger plan, and we understand that there's a oneness, and we understand that everyone is equal and a part of that. And so that can be really beautiful, and that we bring that and we role model that philosophy. We can sense what's underneath, so not just what's on the surface. So sometimes that's a strength and sometimes that feels like a weakness, but you know, we know when someone is wearing a mask and when they're not being genuine, and we can hold compassion for them because everyone kind of puts on these masks and does that as well. You know, we experience this like greater consciousness, this ability to tap in, and we're definitely going to talk a little bit later about being intuitive and how we tap into that, because many empaths and many HSPs are also intuitive. And so being in this oneness can be amazing. And we experience life from a multi-dimensional perspective. So we experience it energetically, mentally, emotionally, physically, spiritually, and it's like all of these realms, and it makes it very rich life. We're often called to be of service, to give something back, whether that's healing work or being a teacher or just really connecting in with your community and giving back as a volunteer. I mean, empaths, obviously, we're empathic. You know, we care deeply about what happens in our world. And we can receive messages in many forms. So let's talk a little bit about the language of energy, because I think this is really important. First, there's mental energy. So not only are we very self-reflective about our own thoughts, but some empaths can actually tap into the thoughts and intentions of others. So sometimes I call this the BS detector. You know, when someone's saying something on the surface, but it doesn't match what's underneath, we can sense that disparity. It's like, do I say something? Do I not say something? But this mental energy is one of the energy fields that we can feel the shifts in. And obviously emotional energy is probably the way that most empaths connect in, and this can feel really intense. Not only do you have your own intensity of emotion because you're a highly sensitive person to start with, and you have that emotional responsiveness, but we can sense that with other people. And a good example of this is when I worked back in the corporate world, my supervisor and I were sitting in a meeting, and he was getting really upset about something that I really didn't actually care about. And all of a sudden I could feel this ball of like anger rising up in my stomach. And so I said to myself, this is not mine. I ask it to be released down into the earth. And so we can feel these emotions. And sometimes before you become really trained as an empath, it kind of feels like a roller coaster. It's like, one moment you're here and then the next moment you're here. And some of that is yours and some of that is actually someone else's. So asking yourself, did I have any experience which would lead me to feel this way? If the answer is no, then you probably are picking up somebody else's emotion. And then physical energy. Many empaths can sense in other people's bodies what's happening to them. This is where medical intuitives come in. This is where healers come in, and they can actually sense where there's an issue, where there's a blockage, where there's pain, and then help people with that healing work. And the collective energy, I was saying this last year was really intense for many, many empaths because of all of the shifts and changes that are going on in our world, going from nationalism and globalism and the debate back and forth about those two ways of being, the issues between the genders and working things out between men and women, all the politics that goes on, violence and different things that we see. So this collective energy can be really positive as well, but we sense that, we see what's happening on a group or an organization or a country or a world level. And then there's environmental energy. So these are picking up on the shifts in the world around us, like the cycles of nature. Some people are really tuned in to the cycles of the moon and are really impacted by that. They can be impacted by shifts in temperature, light, or sound. And I also included technology in here because we're obviously living in a very technological world. And every text that comes in, every video you watch on social media, everything that you interact with from a technological perspective is an energy form. And so just understanding how that's impacting you is really important. And then, of course, spiritual energy, and how we connect into that oneness, whether you do that through meditation, you do that through walking, you do that through dance or some kind of art form or expression, or prayer, whatever that looks like for you. But some empaths can sense shifts in dimensions beyond our physical reality. Some people connect with those who have passed on. And so this is just kind of a brief overview of the different ways that empath gifts can be expressed. So let's take just a moment to shift over into intuitive. Being intuitive can have this psychological definition, right? It's like the ability to understand immediately without conscious reasoning. So conscious reasoning kind of looks like really logical, here's this step, here's this step, here's this step. Whereas intuitive reasoning is like, oh, all of a sudden I just get this entire picture all at one time. And it's really like pattern recognition and big picture thinking. It's very holistic in its viewpoint, and it pulls from everything that you've ever experienced, everything you've ever read, every movie you've ever seen, and your mind makes these different connections. And then there's the esoteric or the spiritual definition, which is that voice of your higher self within, and the part of you that knows that you're one with all. Some people call it receiving divine downloads or channeling or noticing synchronicities. So depending on where you're coming from, I'm not trying to determine how you define intuitive, but these are a couple of ways that you can do so. And for those of you that are familiar with the Myers-Briggs personality assessment, there are 8 different types who are intuitive, and you'll see that like an INFJ, INFP, the thing they have in common is the N, which stands for intuitive. And according to the Myers-Briggs Foundation, 26% of people who took their assessment scored higher on the intuitive side of the scale. So again, just like being an HSP or being an empath, intuitives are a cultural minority. Like 75% of human beings access information in a more logical, linear fashion, and with what they can can pick up with their five senses versus this holistic viewpoint. So sometimes it can be a little bit challenging to explain to other people how you know what you know. And intuitive messages can show up as strong sensations in your body, like your hair on your arms is standing on end, or you get this feeling in your gut, or you have this like tension in your shoulders, but then you can have an openness to your heart. So sensations in your body could be really positive and affirming, or they could be really closed down. And this is kind of how you know whether something feels like the right way to go or the wrong way to go. Some people see visions or hear sounds. You know, I think this is a place where many intuitives have kind of shut down and not talked about what they receive. Because if you tell someone, I have this inner voice speaking, and we all have inner voices. I mean, this is a part of being a human being. But if you tell someone that, it's like, are they going to think I'm crazy? So, you know, this is a place where intuitives receive information. I mean, I've had really strong you know, knowings from a sound perspective, especially musical lyrics. Sometimes that's exactly like the words I need to hear for what's going on in my life. Dreams are also really powerful. They can either be metaphors or they can show you like a literal future event. And some intuitives have said that, you know, I can actually dream about it and then it happens just shortly afterwards. And then just having a sense of knowing, like you have this certainty and you don't really know how you know, but you just know. And as it plays out, it's like, oh, that's exactly how it happened. Or a sense that something just changed. You look around and you're like, what just happened? Something changed. You know, this is what happens to that as well. Or people or situations, spirit animals, a book shows up at exactly the right time with exactly the right message. These are how intuitive messages can show up in your life. And there's challenges and strengths for being an intuitive as well. So one of the challenges that I find with most of my clients is I don't know that I trust what I know. You know, this thing that comes in seems really strange, or it seems really radical, or it's asking me to do something that is way beyond my comfort zone. So, you know, how can I really trust this? How do I know that it's not my fear talking? How do I know it's not my logical mind talking? So, you know, really understanding how your intuition shows up is the biggest piece. And then integrating the intuitive mind with your logical mind, because we need both of them, right? The logical mind is really the one that navigates in our day-to-day world. The intuition is kind of like pulling everything in, gathering the information, and then it gets processed through the logical mind so that we can put it into some kind of action step, so we can actually make use of it, you know, in a practical sense. And you know, as I said before, because you're a temperate minority, you know, 26%, it can be challenging to describe what you know and how you know what you know. You're like, I just know. And other people are like, what do you mean by that? Well, like, what's the evidence for that? So this can be a challenge for people who are highly intuitive. But when you learn how to believe and trust in your knowing, when you listen to your body, when you listen to that voice, when you read the book that shows up, when you accept that the vision you have is something that you need to pay attention to, life unfolds in a very amazing way. And, you know, these synchronicities, these things that seem to be like random and, oh, I can't believe I heard the same word from 4 different people and it was on TV and it was on the radio and then here's this book title, you know, that's not a coincidence. It's something that's meant for you at that time. There's some learning and some growth there. So you could just pause at any time, you know, close your eyes and really tune in to receive these inspiring ideas and solutions and holistic viewpoints of the world. And because you're a big picture thinker, you can look ahead and see potential for the future. So a lot of intuitives are, you know, very future focused. It is important for us as an intuitive to be present in this moment, to find ways to ground and be really present here together. So I hope that you enjoyed this overview of perceptive souls, highly sensitive people, empaths, intuitives. I hope that you saw some aspects of yourself and you know a little bit more about who you are. You know, my goal with all of the teaching and the coaching and the work that I do and my soul mission into this world is to really help people like you feel that who you are is just fine. As a matter of fact, it's more than just fine. It's miraculous. It's beautiful. It's exactly who you're intended to be. So when we can learn how to embrace these parts of ourselves that we thought at one point were weird, or we felt like the outcast, or nobody understood us, and we realize, wow, there's actually a really large group of people across the globe who actually express these things just like I do. It can be incredibly empowering. You can feel nurtured and supported by the fact that there's this greater web of other people who are tuned in, who are turned on, who are listening to the world around them, who are compassionate, who are deep thinkers. This is just a part of who you are. And I encourage you to embrace and love this part of yourself. Thank you so much for watching. Go out and express your gifts. Honor who you are today. Namaste.